What's up, guys, and welcome back to Mncube Entertainment. So, in the Senzo Meyiwa trial, Advocate Mnisi exposed the ballistic expert, Lieutenant Colonel Sereo. Not only Sereo himself, but also the entire forensic analysis industry. And the question that was posed by Advocate Mnisi was about the objectivity or the subjectivity of the marks that are on the bullet and their interpretation.
Now, would the finding whether a certain mark in a bullet constitutes a striation be a subjective one or not?
The marks that are on the surface of the specimen, they form objective facts.
So, in other words, you cannot look at the mark and say, from my viewpoint, nah, this is not a striation. And somebody comes and say, no, from my viewpoint, this is a striation. In other words, a striation remains a striation, whether you like it or not.
When the marks are there, they are there. So the person who view the specimen, he must interpret what he see on the specimen.
This witness is basically saying the marks
Yes.
are immutable.
Yes.
They are there.
Yes.
They are formed.
Yes.
The only issue is the interpretation or the decoding of the marks, as he says, which is exercised by an examiner. And that will depend on his training, proficiency in the interpretation of those marks. But those marks are ineluctable. They are there.
We agree.
That's what he says, that's not
yes. We agree that those marks are there.
Yes.
But my question is the interpretation of whether those marks constitute a striation or not.
Yeah.
Is it a subjective thing based on the fact, on the experience and the level of education of that person, or what?
Yes, the interpretation, that is the identification of those marks,
Yes.
is subjective in nature.
Thank you. Then that simply means that one expert might identify a certain mark as a striation and the other expert might differ with him, not so?
Yes, if the other expert does not have adequate training, he will not be able to identify what is already on the specimen.
So, in summary, this is what Lieutenant Colonel Serero actually said. The marks that are on the bullet themselves, they are actually objective, they are there. Those cannot be debated. But the challenge now that is there is the interpretation, more like decoding to tell if that is a mark on that bullet or not. And the challenge that is there now is that these marks are interpreted based like on the skill of the expert. So this poses a problem because the analysis of ballistic evidence, as we are seeing from this discussion, is that it carries a subjective element, particularly in determining whether a specific firearm produces those marks or not. What means is that there is a potential for variation in expert opinions, which could actually influence the reliability of ballistic conclusions in legal cases. Because personally, I actually thought that this ballistic evidence was actually definitive and it cannot be challenged. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. It's what I initially thought, but I'm now seeing that it's actually quite subjective and there is actually room for disagreement and error. So now this brings in a very, very big problem. And this problem is that since the opinions of these experts can vary from one to the other, then it's actually very possible for a false conviction to be made that is actually going to be based on the poor interpretation of these marks by these experts. So this should actually teach us that the evidence from ballistics itself should not be used as a primary basis for a legal decision to be made. And what I then did, I then made like a research to try and find out if there are any cases in history where such blunders from ballistic experts have occurred, and it turns out there are actually cases, notable cases, where these errors were made, and these guys were actually arrested, these suspects, based off of these ballistic experts. There is, for example, the case of the Miami gunman in 1981. The FBI actually used the forensic ballistics to link the suspect. This guy goes by the name James Sullivan. And however, later testing on it revealed that the match itself was incorrect. So this guy Sullivan was then later on exonerated, but unfortunately for him, he had spent time in prison. So this issue is actually very, very common, as you can see here. This highlights the subjectivity involved in ballistic analysis, and it actually prompts concerns about the reliability of identification of these marks. And there are so many cases, and even in South Africa itself. For example, there is the case of David and Derek J. This case actually occurred in 2003, and these guys had said that they were wrongfully convicted of a crime based on ballistic analysis that was incorrectly linked to a firearm that was used there. So after an appeal was made and a review of the forensic evidence was then made, it was then determined that the bullet did not match the suspect's firearm, which then led to their release. So this is the challenge that is there with the subjectivity of this forensic analysis. So now this then adds again another further problem, and this problem is that there is actually a loophole that can be used by the defense to actually challenge the forensic evidence, even if the experts come in and say there is a match. So the defense, for example, will be exploiting the inherent subjectivity and uncertainty of the interpretation of these marks to try and cast doubt on the reliability of this evidence. So to try and counter some of these issues, that's why in the ballistics they have so many of these experts. You hear Mangena saying, I verified my work with 4 other experts. So this is actually done to try and minimize these errors as much as possible. So the final question now that is to be asked is that, where was Advocate Mncube taking this argument to? Because obviously he has his client, Mthobisi Mncube, who has a firearm that has been linked to the bullet that was found at the crime scene. So by bringing in this topic of subjectivity on the interpretation of these marks, Advocate Mncube was probably trying to say that the interpretation of these marks that you came up with to say that there is a match, it could be wrong. Obviously, Advocate Mncube didn't say that, but with the way that he was questioning Sereo, he was actually taking that argument there. But obviously, Judge Rata is not going to side with Advocate Mncube on this one. But what is going to occur is that, from what I see, is that Advocate Mncube would have cast doubt on the evidence of this ballistics, so in such a way that when the final judgment is now being put out there by Judge Rata, you would not have to completely rely on the ballistics evidence, because Advocate Mncube would have exposed the challenges that are there with ballistic evidence. So on his side, Advocate Mncube is doing the best that he can to defend his client. And as we have seen, it seems that there is actually a need for forensic analysis to actually improve, and we get a way to get objective results instead of subjective results. So tell me what you think in the comment section, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.